The night wind moved low and steady over the water, as if the North Sea itself were breathing in its sleep, and upon that breathing skin of dark a crown seemed to float, not of gold alone, but of hulls and oars, of harbours and prayer, of silver coins that clicked softly like rain in a priest's hand. He stood at the hinge of two worlds, where fjord and river met, where old oaths smelled of tar and salt, and new vows were inked on vellum by candlelight. Some called him King of the Danes, some of England, some of Norway, yet the title felt less like a fixed stone than a net cast wide across tides. It held so long as knots were watched, so long as men at the edges felt the pull toward a single centre. In winter halls he learned to listen more than to speak. The hall beams creaked, and the ashwood pillars remembered storms far older than any crown. Sagas murmured from the mouths of skalds as sparks climbed and died, stories of fathers who struck west with iron in their hands and light in their eyes, and of the colder wisdom that followed, that a ship can be steered not only by strength at the oar, but by silence at the tiller, and by knowing when to let the current carry what force cannot. He wore authority as a cloak that warmed him and weighed him both. In one country, bishops greeted him with Latin hymns. In another, jarls considered him with the guarded patience of men who count winters. He walked the close streets of English towns where stone towers chimed the hours and markets swelled with wool and wheat. He stood again by northern harbours where gulls stitched white threads across a sky that always seemed about to open. At the edges of his nights lay work no blade could finish, reconciling laws, persuading wary nobles whose pride sat high in the saddle, settling the coinage so that a weight of silver meant the same on both sides of the whale road. He found that the kingdom he ruled was not a single island or a single peninsula, but a corridor of water, a lantern-lit lane of ships from Jutland to the Thames, from the Skagerrak to the Clyde, the sea itself becoming a palace floor whose tiles were currents and whose walls were rumour. Historians still murmur around the long table of time that what he held was not an empire in the marble sense, but a personal union of shores, real as weather, fragile as frost. And maybe that is the truest measure. Not whether maps were coloured as one, but whether fear quieted for a time, whether markets breathed, whether the faithful could cross themselves at dawn without glancing at the door. He paid monks to pray where once raiders had burned, a curious symmetry, as if the same oars that beat toward plunder now kept the peace by their mere presence on the tide. In the hush of a chapel, he left offerings upon altars, while outside on the green, sword edges drowsed in their sheaths. In council, he learned the music of concessions, the small bow of the head that saves a winter's war, the gift that travels farther than a banner. Through his queen, he touched the old Norman threads. Through his captains he held the fjords and the skerries, those stone crumbs the giants dropped at the rim of the world. At night he would sit with a map that was more feeling than fact, lines of coast he knew by smell and by the salt that cracked on a steersman's lips, river mouths that tasted of silt and meadow, shoals that lifted a keel and made brave men gentle. He understood that power gathered like driftwood, piece by piece, and that the wise king learned to lash it with patience. The scribes wrote charters, the minters struck coins, whose faces carried a promise, and in distant markets a woman could sell flax beneath the certainty that tomorrow the road would still be the road. Yet beneath the calm a thunder rolled softly. Rival houses counted cousins. Winter envoys measured which pledge was warmer. Even the churches, draped in incense and song, whispered of Rome, of rights, of the slow gravity of Latin letters that could bind a king as surely as iron rings bind a mast. There were moments, rare and deep, when he walked among the mounds where the oldest stones lifted their mute heads to the sky. Wind slid along runes carved like frozen rivers. Lichen slept in the grooves, and somewhere inside the rock the past went on breathing. He felt himself neither conqueror nor supplicant, but a caretaker standing with keys he did not fully own. A crown is a circle, and circles turn. The sea he loved could offer a mirror one day and a black wall the next. The men he trusted could shine like frost at dawn and be gone by noon. Still, he believed, as the steady burn of whale oil believes in its wick, that order could be nursed along like a winter hearth, fed with measured logs of mercy and law. His ships, dark against the moon road, stitched his realms together the way a healer stitches flesh that would rather part. Some nights the hall fell quiet enough that he heard not the talk of men, but the old house itself, the rafters recalling storm, the floor remembering feet that would never cross it again. He thought of kings before him, of a father whose shadow was a hard school, of blue-eyed winters and the smell of pine pitch on a child's hands. He thought of sons to come, and whether they would inherit not only the helm but the touch upon it, that patient steadiness a man learns only by watching stars move across years. He wondered, because even kings wonder, if a realm made of water can ever truly be held, or if it must be courted anew each season with fair tolls and tender justice, with the soft power of predictability. Perhaps rulership, like seamanship, is less a victory than a practice, one that quiets storm by anticipating them. And when dawn thinned the darkness, and the first gull pulled a white thread through the grey, he rose to greet a day of measured choices. Messengers would go out along roads swollen with last night's rain, a letter to a bishop, a gift to a captain's widow, a levy reduced in a valley where the harvest failed. Small things, yet small things, make a bridge. Far to the east, a strait waited with its narrow song, a place where waters funnel and pass, where a patient crown might one day listen to the clink of silver and hear in it the hum of peace. For now, he closed his hand over the knowledge that a kingdom could be taught to breathe with the sea rather than against it, and somewhere beyond the headlands, in a channel that would soon learn the price of every ship that crossed it, the morning light began to count softly, like coins placed in a careful row. He did not begin alone, nor would those who came after him end what the older stones had started. Somewhere between the hush of fjords and the wary glitter of thrones, a northern realm learned the slow grammar of being one. It began in places where cattle paths met water, where a thing, a gathering beneath a wind-gnawed sky, taught free men to listen, and where kings learned that iron persuades quickly, but law persuades long. In the low fields of Jutland, where soil holds the memory of hooves and ash, a line of rulers pressed their names against time like palms against cold glass. Gorm, who kept to the old gods as if they were winter fire. Harold, his son, who heard another music threading through the bells of missionaries and decided that a baptized crown might hold the realm more gently than a mailed fist. At Schelling, 2 runestones rose like bookends of an age, the elder praising parents, the younger declaring that Denmark was taken and made Christian. And even now, lichen sleeps in their carved riverbeds, while moonlight reads those sentences by touch. Historians still argue in soft, patient tones about how sudden that turning was, whether Harold's cross arrived like thunder or like mist, but in the timbered halls it felt like a practical light, a new wick set beside the old. A king who asked his people to kneel before an unseen god, also built with visible hands, circular fortresses, measured with the craftsman's care, set down on the land like calm breaths, trelleborgs whose ramparts curve so evenly you can almost hear a surveyor counting under his breath. Did they guard roads, stage troops, teach obedience by geometry? Perhaps all of it. Perhaps they were a promise that the realm would be round and whole, that fear would find less room to hide where angles were known, and gates announced themselves. Ships learned new errands in those years. They still leapt toward far markets like hounds, but more often they came home with patience in their holds, timber squared for steeples, iron for ploughshares, bells for chapels whose voices carried across marsh and meadow. The sea, which had been a sharp blade for grandfathers, became a loom. Fjords and straits were threads, and the shuttles were hulls that clicked softly in their berths, as if counting the years aloud. Bishops traced Latin arcs through the air, blessing both crop and keel. Jarls, by degrees, exchanged their private storms for a seat closer to the king's weather. It was not a simple peace. Nothing rooted is simple, but a practiced one, in which a lawsuit might be valued above a raid, and the silver ring at a chieftain's wrist meant weights and measures rather than spoil. In winter, the hall fires listened to new stories braided with the old. Saints who cross seas, the way ravens cross sky. Kings who learned that a prayer can steady a sword arm. Widows who found that church porches shelter bargains as well as grief. And somewhere beneath all of it, the ground itself seemed to soften, as if the realm were exhaling after a long run through bracken and spray. There were setbacks, tight like knots in rope. A son would lean too far into pride. A cousin would count his grievances like coins. A foreign duke would test a border with more parchment than steel. Yet even these frictions polished the realm's idea of itself. Assemblies revised the old codes. Scribes pressed letters into oak with styluses that left no blood at all. Minters found a face that could travel from Ribe to Roskilde without having to explain itself. To the west, shorelines remembered Nut and his wide net, proof that Denmark could breathe beyond its ribs. To the east and south, the narrow channels whispered of something subtler, that a kingdom might someday stand still and let the world pass through it, gathering peace from the simple fairness of passage. That future had not yet been coined, and yet one can hear it forming in the mind's ear. The thought that a strait is not a fence, but a measured invitation, and that the clink of silver, honest, weighed, predictable, can be a lullaby stronger than fear. When dusk reaches you tonight, wherever you are, beneath neon in a far city, or in a quiet room where the fan hums like a distant tide, tell me where you're listening from and what time your clock is whispering. In the soft dark, if this wandering through old halls calms your breath, consider resting here with us again. Subscribe to the entire history, and let these lanterns along the whale road keep glowing for you, part after gentle part, night after easy night. For the making of a realm is not a single shout, but a long patient singing, and we can hum it together until sleep comes. And so the realm's pulse steadied, between fjords and thrones, between a cross carved in stone and a circle walked by sentries on a rampart's crown. A king studied the lay of ditches and doors. A monk studied the lay of souls. A farmer, kneeling at both altar and furrow, studied the weather's unreadable face. Coins passed palm to palm and seemed to warm as they moved. Bridges learned the weight of carts without complaint. Harbours learned the names of ships and said them back like old friends. In such unremarkable miracles, the north became one breath, then another, and far off, as if already awake inside tomorrow. A narrow sound waited, a throat of water between two lands, listening for the day when every mast that slipped through its blue would make a small clear music, the music of a kingdom teaching the world how to pass and pay and bless the tide as it went. It began, as many quiet revolutions do, with a measured idea placed where the world must narrow. There, between the coasts that face each other like two old friends in mid-conversation, the water draws itself into a throat, and every ship that dreams of the Baltic must first learn to speak in this careful voice. In time, a crown learned to listen to that voice and to answer not with trumpet or blade, but with scales, ledgers, and a bell that counted silver without raising its tone. The tale says a king, stern in posture, practical in the way winter is practical, looked at the strait and saw more than waves. He saw a hinge upon which whole seasons of grain and tar and timber would turn. If raiding is a shout, tolling is a hum, and a hum kept steady can outlast the fiercest shout. So it was that the realm placed its logic at the water's throat, and the ships, whether wearing the proud colours of Dutch merchants or the soot of Hanseatic long habit, learned to furl their tempers and offer their papers, their manifests, their coin warmed by many palms. On the headland, a fortress sharpened its silhouette against the changing sky, and lanterns were tended with a tenderness that belied the iron at hand. Guns could bark, yes, but more often they dozed like elderly dogs in the sun, while clerks, with tidy script, gave passage to the world. A toll is a promise, that if you pay the same today you paid yesterday, you may sleep aboard your ship without listening for hoofbeats on the quay. And so merchants who fear chaos more than cost came to bless the rhythm, the way a known bell steadies a morning. The counting was not merely greed, it was governance with the salt left on, a fair weight of rye from the Vistula, a forest's worth of masts from the north, hemp and resin, furs and hides, barrels of fish flashing like hard moons in the dark. These learned to pass under one measured gaze. Flags fluttered, crews stood at ease, then fidgeted, then relaxed, as the routine, like a well-worn prayer, carried them across. There were records to keep, exemptions to grant, protests to hear when a captain argued that storm had already taxed him enough. Some years were warm with peace and profit. Some were tight with quarrels when neighbours bristled at the idea of paying for a sea that God himself had poured. Yet even the quarrels rubbed smooth the habit of passage, for men who shouted at a window one month found themselves returning the next, ready with coin and a smaller voice. The realm discovered a gentler shape of power, a constancy that spreads like oil on water, calming ripples with the promise that the rules will not buckle by noon. Clerks became, in their unassuming way, ambassadors to every cargo, ink-stained hands turning pages that smelled of salt, fish, and resin, their eyes steady as winter stars. Of course, there were storms beyond weather, alliances shifted, empires tried to reach with long arms. A cannonball might once or twice argue where a signature had always sufficed. But the strait, faithful to its narrowness, encouraged proportion. Great powers became smaller at the bottleneck, and the smallest coastal sloop felt almost equal as the queue of masts thinned to single file. And all the while, a city by the water learned to count not only money but moments. Bakers rose before the gulls. Coopers smiled at the pitch that sealed another cask. Children learned the flags of nations before they learned their letters, and the tide, coming and going, behaved like a ledger that balanced itself twice each day. Even skeptics admitted that a toll, predictably kept, is a kind of lullaby for trade. The Crown, listening to that lullaby, found that soft power multiplies like reflections. Lighthouses that curve their light along the skin of evening, pilots who know the channels by memory and kindness, a reputation that travels faster than a fast ship and returns sooner than bad news. If you are listening now with your eyes half closed, far from northern water, yet close to its hush, tell me softly where you are and what time the clock is keeping beside your bed or your window. If the slow counting of silver and the calmer counting of breaths feels good in your chest, consider curling back into this harbour again. Subscribe to the entire history and let these lanterns along the corridor of water keep you company night after night as we follow the hum that outlasts the shout. Some nights, when fog lay on the strait like folded linen, the fortress seemed to float, a stern house dreaming above a silver road. From within, a watchman could hear more than he could see. The soft clatter of blocks, the call and response of crews far out in the grey, the faint syllables of a psalm from a captain who wanted a safe dawn. He would ring the hour and feel it pass through stone, then through the ledger pages, then out across the water in widening, invisible circles. He might think, as thoughtful men do at the edge of things, that justice is simply time made predictable. The hour will sound, the fee will be the fee, the gate will open, the sea will remain the sea. Trade carried not just goods but moods, cod's clean scent, tar's dark reassurance, wheat's hopeful weight. These fragrances braided themselves into civic courage, and while other crowns chase glory that burns hot and dies young, this one tended a quieter hearth, feeding it with the kindling of fairness and the logs of regularity. Thus did a narrow throat teach a broad lesson, that an empire can be as soft as an abacus bead sliding to the bar, as humble as a clerk's nod, as vast as the trust that settles over a harbour when bells, ledgers, and tides keep time together. And somewhere down the corridor, the night kept opening ship by ship, as if the sea itself were counting in its sleep. In a century when parchment could be as sharp as any blade, there came a woman who stitched 3 crowns into one cloak and wore it with the quiet gravity of winter cloud. Some called her Margaret, some the Semiramis of the north, and the halls where she walked learned a new tone, the hushed, attentive cadence of a realm deciding to be larger than its quarrels. At Kalmar, that stone-shouldered town where gulls write cursive over green water. They gathered in 1397 and sealed a dream, Denmark, Norway and Sweden drawn beneath one moon, not melted into sameness but held in the same steady hand. They called it a union, personal, practical, braided by oaths and kinship, and for a time the world seemed to breathe in longer lines. Laws still spoke in their native timbres, yet fleets listened to the same command. Bishops with different habits crossed themselves toward the same dawn. Miners in the red Swedish earth and fishermen in Norwegian fog felt one distant pulse guiding the taxes that weighed upon their days. Historians still lean close to those documents, tilting their heads as if to hear the ink finish drying, and debate, softly, thoughtfully, whether the dream was equality or Danish shelter with Danish weather. Margaret himself preferred balance to blaze. She placed young Eric upon the throne and stood behind him as a tree stands behind wind, advising with the patience of one who knows that a rope frays not from storms alone but from hands that tug without rhythm. The union breathed across water as much as land, its arteries, the same sea lanes that had taught jarls to be merchants and kings to be accountants of wind. And if the realm had a body, its heart beat somewhere between Copenhagen's piers and the deep inlets of Bohus and Bergen, each tide a systole, each convoy a diastole, preserving warmth in far fingers of ice and pine. Yet no cloak covers every unease. The Hanse towns guarded their privileges like embers cupped against rain. Swedish nobles, proud and stone-faced, counted the coin of their iron and forests and wondered whether distant clerks understood the cost of winter in Dalarna. Norse skippers, hard as oak, loved the Union's promise when storms rose and loved their autonomy when seas were flat. Eric, older now than the boy who first wore 3 weights of gold, looked toward the narrow throat of the Sound and thought, as administrators often do, in the language of systems, if passage shapes prosperity, let passage be measured. If a gate must be held, build a house around the gate and keep the lamps trimmed. Thus the ledger's hum joined the Union song, and the world learned to pause between those 2 headlands and pay for predictability. But the dream, for all its breadth, lived as such dreams always do, at the tolerance point of 100 local breaths. A Swedish rising would flicker like a candle, guttering, then catching. A treaty would soothe, a marriage would promise, and the old frictions at the seams would begin their patient, grinding music again. None of this was failure so much as proof that a union is a craft, a daily shaping. You can hear it in the scrape of quills in Stockholm's grey light, in the clink of coins at Oslo's quay, in the scrape of boots on Copenhagen's stairs where stewards climbed with news of both good harvests and quiet resentment. In council chambers, a map lay open like the palm of a giant hand. Fjords etched like lifelines. Councillors debated how to hold the fingers together without pressing so hard that feeling fled. Margaret, before the end, had seen far enough to know that empires of velvet endure only when the velvet is mended each season. After her, mendings grew more hurried, stitches uneven, and still the garment held long enough to shelter skippers in storm and merchants on narrow margins. Some nights in Kalmar the castle hummed like a hive. Envoys shared wary bread, and down in the harbour a boy counted masts from a warehouse roof and gave each one a secret name. He could not have known that one day a darker hour would fall, the blood-lit page of a Stockholm dawn, the old dream folding back into 3. But in his small counting there was the Union's fragile miracle, that for a generation or 2 the North learned to speak across its differences without losing itself to them. If you are listening with the lights low, tell me gently where you are and what time your window keeps. If the thought of 3 shores breathing together quiets you, let it settle, and if you wish, subscribe to the entire history so that this slow braid of nights keeps arriving at your bedside, ship by ship, part by patient part. For beyond the scribes and treaties, the sea itself remembered the dream and carried it forward. Crews who spoke in different vowels, learning the same tide. Chapels in far villages tolling toward the same weather. A sense that the corridor of water might be safer when 1 lantern, not 3, was trimmed. And out there, near the strait where passage becomes a rule and rules become a comfort, a fortress began to listen, stone arranged to hear fog and oath alike, its windows holding the last faint light as if it were a promise not to be spoken but kept, a listening house on a headland, waiting for the hour when bells, ledgers and waves would keep time together. Night came to the headland the way a shawl is laid across tired shoulders, and the great house of stone, square, watchful, almost tender in its angles, took its place between 2 darknesses, the land behind it and the sea before it. In its inner courts, lamplight moved like warm breath along arches. On the ramparts, A salt wind combed the flags until their cloth learned the patient grammar of the strait. Those who kept watch there knew that power could be loud, but did not need to be. The guns, long-mouthed and iron-scented, lay like hounds beside their keepers. Dreaming of thunder they seldom had to make. More often, the fortress worked by listening. It listened to fog, the footstep of the sea, when it wished to go barefoot. It listened to rigging singing in different tongues, the tight whispers of Dutch and Hans, the broad vowels of English hulls, the clipped prayers of skippers from Livonia who had carried winter on their coats. It listened to coin, which has its own voice when counted carefully, a soft river of silver that braided itself through ledgers until rules became comfort and habit became a kind of peace. Here the narrow water made even the proudest mast stand in single file, and that gentle hum of order, ring the hour, show the papers, weigh the dues, was the castle's true artillery. Some say the toll was a tax on God's free road, others that it brought predictability enough to be called mercy. In council rooms scented with wax and chalk, clerks debated exemptions with the courtesy of men who know storms can argue too, and pilots, mouths salt-burned and steady, guided hulks through currents as if reading a psalm with their hands. Historians still tilt their heads, patience in their voices, when they speak of this place, a boundary that behaved like a promise, a wall that earned its keep by opening its gate the same way every time. At night, the city below settled into its own music. Coopers set aside hoops, still warm from the fire. A baker's oven sighed and went to embers. A child, wrapped against the draught, fell asleep, naming the flags he had seen, crosses, tricolours, devices bright as beetles, each one a small miracle from a far room of the world. On the quay, an old sailor traced with a tar finger the map he no longer owned, finding his way by memory from Scania's low beaches to the wolfish tide below Hirschholmener, then east to the Skerries, where threads of moonlight hung like fishing line. The fortress, hearing all this, did not answer. It kept the hour, it kept the peace, and when fog lifted it kept the view, which was both short and endless. Short because the headlands cupped the sea in their palms. Endless because every mast that passed carried a piece of elsewhere, the scent of resin from Archangel forests, the iron breath of Swedish mines, the buttery promise of Baltic grain. Somewhere in the stone, a legend would be born, a melancholy prince looking for the shape of his father's voice, but even that dramatic sorrow would seem like a theatrical echo laid atop the truer, quieter labour of the place, to turn storms into schedules, neighbourly suspicion into ritual, the chance of chaos into the habit of fairness. There were, as always, days when the habit creaked, treaties wrinkled, rival admirals measured distance with tempers as well as compasses. A distant court called the toll an insult to sovereignty and sent ships to prove a philosophical point. The fortress could growl when it had to, fire walking its parapets like red cursive against the sky. But even then, the governing instinct here was proportion. Let the powder speak once, let the bells speak forever after. For the strangest alchemy at this threshold was how grandeur became modesty. Empires arriving like capes full of wind were reduced, kindly, methodically, into a name in a ledger, a weight on a scale, and century whose tidy ink proved that tomorrow would resemble today. In such alchemy, a people finds sleep. The city learned to dream in 2 tides a day. Shopkeepers learned the seasons by the way hulls sat in the water. Widows learned that a pension's coin, however modest, arrived as predictably as the pilot's lantern. In winter, when dusk came early and frost wrote its careful script upon the panes, the castle's windows glowed like a row of small hearths, and travellers on the far bank, seeing those squares of amber stitched into the dark, felt their shoulders lower, as if the very sight were a guarantee. If you are listening with the lights down and the room breathing softly, tell me quietly where you are in the world and what time your clock is keeping beside your bed or your tea. If the slow pulse of tides and the even clink of measured silver are steadying your own breath, you are welcome to linger with us again, subscribe to the entire history, and let this corridor of water keep its watch for you night after night, part after part, like a lantern left in a window so a friend might always find the door. Toward morning the fortress lifted its face from the sea as a sleeper lifts from a dream, and the gulls, those white scribes of the sky, returned to practice their bright marginalia above the masts. Clerks straightened pages, sentries stamped warmth back into their boots. A pilot laced his jacket and tasted the weather as one tastes soup. Out beyond the headland a dark ship turned her shoulder to the swell and kept going, past the known lanes and their ringing logic, past the promises of scale and stamp, out toward Colders, toward ice that squeaks like new leather when it breaks, toward coasts where a chapel's bell might sound like a star fallen into snow. The castle watched her go without envy. It had its own vow to keep at the gate, and in that small exchange, one ship seeking the far blue, one house holding the near rule, the north arranged its mourning, a balance between the dreaming edges of the world and the measured middle that makes dreaming safe. And somewheres on that farther line, where whales write brief sentences in spray and night never quite forgets the taste of winter, another story was already drawing near. The ship that slipped past the headland carried a hush different from the ledger's hush, a listening tuned to ice and distance, and those aboard learned to read a paler grammar, where the sea grows slow and the sky forgets its colour. They followed birds first, as men have always done, fulmars like scraps of cloud, kittiwakes, stitching the horizon with short white dashes. Then they followed a temperature, a change in the air that tasted like stone kept in a cold room. Toward Greenland the water darkened until it seemed to drink light. Bergs took form, as if the night itself had lifted into floating walls. The sound of the world changed to a wet glassy note, like breath across a bottle. Here the business of empire, tolls and treaties, and the respectable clink of silver fell away into older exchanges, blubber cutting and bone gleam, the breath of whales rising like slow prayers, the barter of cloth for pelts, iron for insight, centuries braided in this blue. Long before a Danish crown charted plans, Norse settlers had raised turf-walled churches on cold meadows where summer is a rumour. They grazed cattle under a shy sun and carved their memories into stone before the wind learned their names. Historians still argue, gently, about what thinned those farms to nothing, the little ice age pressing its thumb upon the land, the trade in walrus ivory cooling when other tusks found favour, a stubborn clinging to old ways that grew brittle in the new cold, or perhaps simply a slow human dwindling, the way a candle goes out, not with drama but with a tired nod. Later still came men with a different mission and a different patience, crossing back under a flag that promised care and curiosity at once, a pastor stepping ashore with a psalter held like a coal against the wind, walking toward Inuit houses where snow shapes doorways soft as sleep, listening more than speaking, learning syllables that move like water over stones. The whales, indifferent to scripture yet faithful to their own liturgy, drew lines across the bays with their backs, flensing knives whispered along fat that would soften lamps at home, Casks sighed as they took on oil that smelled of winter and fire together. In the ship's cramped warmth, maps unfurled like restrained dreams, fjords with names that tasted of consonants and mist, capes that would test timbers and will, promontories where a man might think he'd reached the edge of the page. What use is such far work to a small kingdom? So the clerks at home might wonder. And yet, back in Copenhagen, in shops that remembered the sound's dependable hum, the lamps burned longer on nights when the fog closed in, and a city's patience learned to glow by a flame coaxed from the ribs of creatures who moved like mountains underwater. Trade and tenderness mingled strangely in that cold, crewmen swapping songs with hunters whose kayaks wrote cursive on black water, a missionary baptizing a child with a hand that smelled of seal oil, a boy learning to steer by stars that feel nearer in a sky swept clean of everything but truth. Reports came home in the neat letters of men unused to exaggeration, yet even their tidiness could not smooth the looseness of ice or the stubbornness of weather. Ships were late, sometimes they were gone. Those who return from the white carry a silence with them, a space inside conversation where snow continues falling. Still, the corridor of water that led north was a thread the crown could not quite stop touching, as if some part of the realm found itself clarified by the idea that at the map's pale edge, order could be coaxed from cold by ritual. Nets mended the same way each dawn. Prayers said with slow sincerity, tea boiled while the tent's canvas ticked in frost. In the end, little is finished in such places. Everything is begun and begun again. Harpoons are sharpened while the sea pretends to sleep. A birchbark box is traded for a story that will cross an ocean. The names of bays are added to lists like beads on a cord. And when the crews at last turned for home, dragging their wake across the grey, with the patience of men who have learned to trust the modest miracle of sound wood, they brought back more than oil and pelts. They brought the memory of traces, footprints that fill with snow and vanish, cans that stand as if listening, stones scratched with signs to remind a returning mind where it once belonged. Back in the mild streets, where flax dries on a line and the toll bell keeps the hours like a thoughtful friend, those signs would find their cousins, letters cut into older granite in fields that hold the warmth of many summers, a language of stone preparing to speak again. In the warmer fields, where barley whispers and stones keep their counsel, letters once learned to walk upon granite as if the earth itself wished to remember. The runes did not shout. They moved like careful footfalls, each cut a small breath, held and released, each line a path laid across time. He would come sometimes, king, courtier, monk, who had set aside his Latin for an afternoon, to stand by such stones the way one stands by an elder's chair, not to command, but to listen. The older marks wore the weariness of weather with patience. Lichen softened their edges as moss softens a voice, yet the sentences held, and if one traced them with a fingertip, one could feel an intent that predates conquest, not merely to boast, though boasting has its place in a young world, but to bind the living to the dead and the land to a name. At Jelling, where two mounds rise like sleeping shoulders, and a church nestles between them like a thought deciding to become a promise, the stones stand as if they had grown there, one for parents and the old gods, one for a people and a new faith. Gorm's love, Harold's declaration, the small, strong word, made. These are not just clauses. They are nails driven into a house so that winter stays outside. Historians murmur gently about intention, how much of a realm can be carved into a rock, and whether the younger stones cross as thunder or mist, command or persuasion. But the fields, honest to their own labour, answer with harvests. What matters is that men and women came to this place, spoke the names aloud, and then sowed within hearing of those syllables, trusting that a memory publicly carried will guard a furrow more kindly than iron alone. Elsewhere, along roads that were once no more than scholars' conjectures and farmers' common sense, other rune stones tilted toward the sky with the humility of everyday remembrance. This bridge built, this husband mourned, this voyage attempted and completed, this gift returned to God in gratitude for a season without plague. You could walk a lifetime among such markers and come to know the true pulse of a country, the small repairs of community, the quiet courage of a widow who paid for a crossing so feet after hers would stay dry, the pride of a son who wanted it written, that his father was generous on the thing as well as fierce at sea. And yet the writing itself began to change, as rivers do when they meet other waters. Monks came with their tidy curls of script, ink ran where chisels once sang, words lengthened into Latin's patient ropes, and kings who had once spoken in the square angles of Elder Futark found their names expanding into softer shapes, the vowels like sails catching broader winds. There is no betrayal in this, only the turning of a page. A realm that was learning to breathe in agreements and ledgers found in parchment a kind of harbour, yet in the fields the stones kept speaking in their slower grammar, reminding anyone who listened that law is not only letters but also memory that has attached itself to the place where you live. In certain winters the church door would open upon a snow that carried no sound at all, and a priest, stepping out with a book held like a coal against the cold, would pass a stone whose grooves were filled with thawing frost. He would touch it lightly, as if greeting another clergyman in an older vestment, and continue, content that both languages would work together for the keeping of souls and boundaries. There were disputes, as there must be, about fields whose lines had drifted like dunes, about whether a rune's intention could overrule a seal's wax. But these quarrels taught more than they tore. They taught that a people's story is safest when it is told twice, once in the earth and once on the page, once on. Sometimes a traveller from far coasts would stand with a hand on a granite flank and try the sounds aloud, surprised at the way the letters seemed to rise into the mouth like fresh water drawn from a deep well. He would think, perhaps, of other stones, of memorials where Knut had his prayers said in English towns, of boundary markers along the Sound, where the toll would someday count with a softer certainty, and he would feel the old North arranging itself again, piece by patient piece, into a place where speaking and inscribing make one promise. The rune master's craft waned, as moonlight must, but it left a silver behind, even in streets where brick and beam grew busy, and merchants threaded ledgers with the haste of profit. A stone would surprise a passer-by from a churchyard's edge, a reminder in blunt, beautiful lines that kingship began with the duty to remember, and the stones remembered more than the powerful. They remembered dogs whose names are lost and yet are not. They remembered a failed voyage offered up without shame. They remembered bridges, oh the many bridges, their planks polished by thankful feet, their sponsors' names cut as plainly as a prayer. To read them is to feel a hand on one's shoulder, the hand of someone who lived here before, saying quietly that responsibility is a circle one steps into, not a chain one drags. When the day thinned and the first star pried itself gently from the blue, the fields would settle into their small music, a gate clicking, a kettle sighing, a child repeating a name that seems older than language. Far off, in the city, that had learned to speak in masts and markets, other letters brightened, the kind that catch fire as easily as they catch meaning. For stones keep, but timber burns, and somewhere along the waterfront a breath would be drawn that tasted of smoke and salt together, and in that taste the next chapter waited, with ash in its pockets and sails at the ready. Cities, like ships, learn to breathe again after the sea has taken its due, and there were nights when Copenhagen exhaled smoke the way a hull exhales bilge, slowly, inevitably, until the very stars looked singed. Fire took the town more than once, not as a single monstrous mouth, but as a patient eater, moving from eve to eve, where timber remembered the warmth of older winters too well. In 1728, the flames wrote their long sentence across roofs and lanes, and again in 1795, another red grammar revised what the first had spared. He, king, clerk, cooper, widow, apprentice, stood in streets where heat became a wall that spoke with a lion's breath. Beams fell with a sound like oaths breaking. Bells, which had once counted coin and tide with even voices, rang in a high, pleading register. Yet even as ash took its drift over churchyards and canals, the city discovered the same quiet instinct that had steadied us straight. Proportion, routine, the knowledge that such disasters are answered by hands before they are answered by history. Lines formed for buckets as if forming for vespers. Boats kissed the quays and became ambulances of water. In warehouses where tar had daubed its black blessing on every beam, men and women moved ledgers and children with equal care. Morning came pale and parched, roofs like bitten bread along the skyline, and in that light a resolve took the same cool form it had taken on ramparts and at runestones. Rebuild with measures. Streets widened as if to learn to breathe. Brick rose where timber had once been too eager to please a spark. Canals were kept like polished arteries. A new geometry took hold in squares where markets would set their stools again. The city went afloat even before it was fully ashore. Rafts and barges shuttled stone and lime as if the harbour itself were an extra street. Masts stitched a temporary skyline above the blackened one, and the dockyards at Holman, busy with the Navy's old pride, turned toward civilian patience, providing ribs for houses as much as for hulls. There were blueprints unfolded with a reverence usually granted to salters. Surveyors counted paces like beads, and builders lifted each course of brick with a steadiness that remembered how easily heat can speak louder than law. At night, while the ruins cooled to the colour of thought, lamps burned with oil coaxed from whales whose backs were still dreaming in polar bays. Greenland's distant hush sent small flames to Copenhagen's palms, and the city's pulse ticked against the glass. It was not only walls that returned, habits returned, which is how a people recognises itself. The toll bell at the sound resumed its tempered song, and silver, counted carefully in rooms that smelled of mortar dust and warm bread, found its way into rafters and roofs, schools and sheds, a dull gleam turning into shelter. Carpenters learned to speak softly in rooms that had been loud the week before. Widows learned the difference between the sting of smoke and the sting of relief when a pension arrived on time. Merchants learned to trust that the same fee paid in the morning would yield the same evening, even after the noon had burned. Children, whose eyes keep the clearest chronicles, played in streets where scorched patterns still drew their black lace along thresholds, and they memorized the flags of ships as if memorizing a civic prayer. Dutch orange, English blue, Swedish gold, 1,000 varieties of elsewhere drawn close to the wharf like neighbours returning with bread. In these comings and goings, the city was both aflame and afloat, a flame in memory, afloat in practice, its survival braided to the same corridors of water that fed its ledgers, its churches, its stubborn tenderness for order. There were moments askew with melancholy, a burned doorpost that still held the palm height marks of a child's growth, a charred Bible salvaged and open to psalms already known by heart, a gull circling slow over a square where ovens, once reliable as breathing, were cold as pewter, but the city's character preferred repairs to lament. Gardens were replanted where ash felt like a second darker soil. Sheds rose in the precise kindness of right angles. Bakers' ovens relearned their sigh. And across the bridges, the air brightened with the smell of tar and yeast interweaving like old friends. If anyone wondered whether such endurance needed a theology, they found it not only in sermons but in practices. In the way a pilot nodded to a clerk, who nodded to a porter, who nodded to a widow, who had her rent, because a convoy had come, because a toll had been paid, because a rule had been kept. Far beyond, the Hanse towns measured their own fortunes and sent their ships anyway, because predictability is a balm even to pride. And if some evenings a boy stood at Nihan watching the slow parade of bowsprits, he could imagine that the masts were a forest the city had planted against disaster, a grove that drank salt instead of rain, and rustled not with leaves, but with cordage, singing sundered melodies into a single workable tune. He would grow into a man who knows that ash becomes mortar, that masts become streets, that a city can be rebuilt as you would re-reef a sail, carefully, with an ear for the wind and an eye on the horizon's level line. In time, the scars hid themselves under stucco and brick, yet at dusk, when windows kindle and the harbour keeps its glassy breath, one can still taste the old smoke in the air, faint as a rumour, a reminder that what floats must once have burned or will burn again, and that the wiser craft is to learn how to pass goods and comfort along the water with a softness that sleeps through storms. And somewhere down to that soft corridor, where guild halls polish their tablets and scales wait with their patient tongues, the slow dance of trade was drawing near, silk imagining its own warmth against snow as coin rehearsed the weight of another peaceful day. Winter has its own market, quiet as a prayer, and in those pale months the north learned a choreography that looked like patience, but sounded, if one leaned close, like the soft rustle of silk against wool. Trusses of Baltic flax rode low under a sky the colour of pewter. Tar bled its dark reassurance from casks bound with hoops that sighed in the cold. The footfalls of merchants along timbered quays kept time with bells that counted the hours without hurry. Lubeck spoke first in the old hand's tongue of ledgers and custom, its brick crowns holding the fog as if fog were a kind of wealth. Danzig answered with grain that remembered long summers, even while snow braided the rigging. Riga sent timber whose sap slept, but whose promise did not. Bergen, with cod hung like a silvery alphabet from eaves, drew vowels out of the wind and offered them to every passing hull. Between these cities and the narrow throat that listened to them all, a small kingdom practiced a wide art, making predictability into hospitality, offering the comfort of known weights, known stamps, known rules that did not change because the weather did. The sound was a metronome. Pilots felt the current in their ribs, the way a good tailor feels the drape of cloth. Clerks, warm-inked and steady-eyed, turned pages that smelled faintly of resin and winter apples. The fortress on the headland, half house, half ear, tilted its stone toward fog and oath alike, and kept its counsel. In that steadiness, trade discovered a lullaby, masts queuing without sulk, flags learning the grammar of single file, crews settling into a discipline that held back chaos like a well-fitted door holds back night. Historians, careful as watchmakers, still open those city archives and find the same rhythm beating softly, entries that add rather than subtract from one another's dignity, disputes that cool under the weight of routine, the long skein of years in which an invoice can be read like a psalm, each column a reassurance that tomorrow recognises today. There were luxuries among these honest burdens, and they moved differently, like a secret the cold could not quite hush. A bolt of silk lifted from a chest brought a private summer into the counting room. It poured across a palm with a memory of distant heat, of hands that died by moonlight along rivers crowded with banyans and prayers. Amber from old seas winked in the lamplight as if the sun had been trapped in honey and forgotten there. Pepper announced itself with a sneeze that turned into laughter. Indigo arrived in cakes that stained fingers like confessions. The hands, shrewd and sometimes stubborn, had long rehearsed these exchanges beneath gilt gables where swans nested against coats of arms. Denmark, with its gate at the water's throat, learned to turn the rehearsal into reliable performance. Not empire in the trumpet sense, no bronze eagles, no marching squares. More a housekeeper's empire. Shelves labelled, jars sealed. A key on a string that opens the storeroom at the same hour every day. And yet the house had windows. Through them the world glanced in. A Dutch factor whose cuffs were frayed, but whose accounts sang. A Scotsman who swore that snow sharpened the mind for bargaining. A widow in a rough cloak, carrying the last proof of a husband's life, a tally of barrels delivered to Nyborg, and refusing to be dismissed until the coin matched the promise. The city, cured by fires and seasoned by fog, liked such honest insistence. Scales nodded, seals bit into wax, and somewhere behind all the talk, the sea kept breathing in and out like a great animal that had learned its place by the hearth. There were frictions, as there must be, where pride and necessity cross. A Hanse convoy would sometimes frown at the toll, as if God's road had been paved by committee. A Danish assessor, too fond of his quill, might mistake accuracy for severity. Winter, always the truest negotiator, would break a mast with a shrug and send arguments to the bottom before they could be finished. But even storms polish the habit of passage. A captain who shouted one year returned quieter the next, coin ready, papers warmed in his breast. A guild that complained at supper raised a toast by dawn because the rules had kept their apprentices fed. In counting houses trimmed with evergreen at Yule, candles gutted and steadied as clerks read aloud from letters ferried by ice-stiff postboys, assurances from Bremen, blessings from Stockholm, a warning from Königsberg that spring would be late, and always, like a basso, under every melody, the sounds, even logic, show, pay, pass, show, pay, pass. It was the kind of liturgy that made sleep possible in neighbourhoods that had known how easily fire or famine could visit without knocking. Sometimes the corridor of water drew the world closer than anyone expected. A bale labelled for Amsterdam cracked open to reveal a scrap of poem in another hand, another alphabet. A sailor from Narva tried the word hygge in his mouth and smiled as if it fit. A monk buying lamp oil with silver, earned far to the north, told a story about a glacier that groaned in its sleep like an old bishop. And in the corners, where business pauses to adjust its cuffs, kindness went walking. A cup of hot beer pressed into a cold hand. A porter's back volunteered where a rope burned. A pilot's lantern swung a little wider for the sloop, with a newly orphaned boy at the tiller. Trade in such seasons was not merely arithmetic, but away the north kept its collective pulse, slow, steady, not afraid of darkness, so long as lights could be trimmed. Even the city's feasts learned to taste of elsewhere, cinnamon working its warm arithmetic into porridge, a silk ribbon at a bride's throat so blue it seemed to remember a sky from far away, a salter rebound in leather that smelled faintly of spices and sea. And yet, as the century turned its pages with a patient thumb, certain eyes kept lifting over the ledger's edge toward longer lines on the map. If a gate could be kept at the water's throat, perhaps a door could be opened at the world's hip. If a toll could teach fairness to a stream of hulls, perhaps a distant shore could teach the gate its own humility. Ships built with the same care that held the Sound's promise began to dream in their slips, dream of monsoon bells and languages that carried vowels like rain, of chapels whose plaster would taste of salt blown off a different ocean. The silk that had drifted into winter rooms like contraband summer began to suggest its own origin story, a thread that asked to be followed back through hands and harbours to a place where the sun climbed differently. And so, while snow made lace on casement panes and cod creaked on the racks as if they were trying to remember their last deep song, a few holes were caulked with a quieter intention, to carry not only goods, but a way of keeping promises across a longer blue. Down at the quay, a boy who had learned to read by looking at flags watched a carpenter plane a plank until it shone. He touched the curl that fell from the blade and felt it try to write in the air. He could not know the word yet, but if someone had whispered tranquil bar, it might have settled in his chest like a seed preparing itself for heat, for new birdsong, for a chapel bell heard at dusk through the palms, and the sound, faithful as ever, kept counting softly as those longer voyagers closed their eyes and began to imagine their first dawn. The first thing they learned was the shape of the wind. How, after months of grey latitudes and the even pulse of the Sound, the air near the Indian shore seemed to turn and kneel differently, warm and scented, as if the ocean itself had been steeped in flowers. Sails slackened and filled on a schedule not their own, and the sea wore new colours, greens with gold folded inside them, blues that had swallowed the sky and kept it. Ahead, a low line of palms lifted their deliberate hands. Behind them, roofs and courtyards leaned toward the water, as if listening for a familiar footfall. Tranquil bar, they called it in the tongue they had brought, though those who had lived there far longer knew its older name, Tharangambadi, the place where waves sing, and the shoes that stepped ashore learned at once that the song was many things. At once, market chatter and temple bells, the scroll of monsoon cloud rolling in like scripture, the quiet arithmetic of a fort built to hold a promise at the edge of another promise. Fort Dunsborg settled on the sand like a patient animal, yellowed walls softening the sun into something a human eye could bear. From its verandas, the horizon stretched so far that time itself felt longer, and those who had been schooled by the strait's narrow justice now stood in a light that asked for wider manners. A treaty had been set years before, measured in pallets and courtesies with the ruler inland who kept this coast beneath his broader weather. The company's factor learned to bow in a way that did not break him. Interpreters learned to braid two tempers into one sentence. Ledgers learned new columns for pepper and cloth that shone like evening. Some evenings, when the heat finally let go and the sea remembered to breathe as the north remembers, the fort became a listening house again, the rustle of saris along the lane, the creak of a bullock cart that had learned the route by heart, the soft thump of palm fronds against a sky that never quite forgot its brightness. Traders counted by the Sound's old habit, show, pay, pass, but here the verbs took on local colour. The coin warmed in different palms, and the weight of a bale seemed to hold the story of many rivers strung with bunions and prayers. And then there were the men who came ashore with books rather than bills, their collars stiff with a Lutheran earnestness carried carefully across the long blue, their hearts quick with a curiosity that mistook itself for certainty, and some days repented of that mistake in the shade of a tamarind tree. They opened a press whose letters learned to sit in Tamil, tall and elegant, and when their first lines in that language crept across paper like fresh water, the town's sound seemed to lean closer, schoolboys murmuring consonants that felt like pearls between the teeth, a woman smiling at a page held up to the late sun, a printer wiping his hands and wondering at work that sang without hammers. Historians, gentle as they sift the old sand for footprints, still speak softly about motives, how trade and mission plaited their strands, how care and condescension sometimes shared a plate, yet even in such caution the human music remains, a pastor learning to sit on a woven mat without impatience, a scholar asking the word for mercy in a language older than his church, a fisherman bringing a small gift of dried fish to a man whose prayer did not sound like his own. The fort's flag rose and fell with seasons, but the tide taught everyone the same lesson it had taught in the north, that rules, trimmed kindly, can be a kind of shelter, and that even far from home, the habit of fairness can make a harbour where difference would otherwise sharpen to edges. There were quarrels in the heat, of course, about duties and respect, about which promise had been made, by whom to whom, in which year, of which ruler's moon. But the air itself carried a balm, jasmine walking its sweetness down the alleys, rain arriving on schedule with the authority of a psalm. The sea reminding all parties that it would have its way whether men agreed or not. In the mission house a brass lamp kept a small patient sun. In a courtyard girls threaded flowers with fingers that forgot no pattern. In the warehouse pepper sneezed its laughter into the ledgers until even the sternest clerks smiled. And in the fort's cool rooms a map that had been brittle with northern damp began to lie flat, compliant, as if the monsoon had smoothed not only the paper, but the thought that rode upon it. Sometimes, just after dusk, when the sky held on to its violet, as if reluctant to pass the flame to night, the chaplain would step onto the sand and watch fishermen push their catamarans into the dark. 3 men, a torch, a low craft that seemed made of shadow and resolve, and he would think, not without trembling, that faith is most honest when it borrows the patience of those who know tides by breath. In the early mornings before the sun showed its golden teeth, the fort looked inland, and the fields returned the look, a conversation of dew and stone. By noon the horizon sprawled again, and the company learned once more the difference between holding and standing near. And always, beneath contracts, beneath catechisms, the older song persisted. Waves riding up the sand with their syllables shaped by moon and earth, saying what they had said before. The first mast pierced the first cloud. Far away, in rooms where the sound's bell counted silver, someone would note a cargo tallied at tranquil, a letter received and answered, a soul claimed, a debt forgiven. The entry would be neat, and lamps lit with oil from colder coasts would keep the ink from drying too soon. Yet those same lamps might flicker briefly at the thought that trade moves along both rims of the world, and that the gatekeeper, who has learned the manners of the East, must also remember the long western shore where golden drums keep their own ledgers. When night thickened and the fort held its breath as if it too wished to sleep, the surf stitched its white edge along the beach and then unstitched it again, a seamstress working by moonlight, at a garment that never finishes, and somewhere across the dark shoulder of the ocean, where the land rises red and forts stand like chessmen above a surf that speaks in deeper vowels, another watchman lifted a lantern and listened for a ship that would carry this story into shadow. The coast rose like a reddish hymn from the sea, and along it the fort stood, white geometry against laterite earth, as if someone had set chessmen to watch the horizon breathe. They had Danish names the surf learned to pronounce, Christiansborg above the long sigh of the surf at Osu, Frederiksborg lifting its clean angles farther down the shore, smaller posts whose stones remembered both lime and salt, and within their courts a different drum kept time, one that mixed the sound's measured clink with something older, deeper, and human as heartbeat. He walked the rampart at dusk and felt the air's weight, a warm hand over the mouth of evening. Below, a fishing canoe folded into the swell like a dark petal, and somewhere inland a talking drum began to answer the sea, syllables of wood and hide, carrying news in tones the forts would never fully understand. Markets gathered near the walls in shadows that smelled of palm oil and smoke. Cloth patterned like rain lay beside iron bars that remembered other latitudes. Beads held small suns within them. Cola nuts clicked in baskets like tidy promises. Yet the same courtyards echoed with the sorrow the ledges could not capture. Rooms that kept cool for the wrong reasons. Doors that learned to speak a single hard vowel when they closed. Columns of numbers that moved like ants toward ships waiting with their own dark arithmetic. Historians speak, as gently as such speaking allows, of trade braided with the theft that never ends, of treaties struck with rulers whose drums knew a different history, of coastal towns that learned the double vocabulary of bargaining and grief. And the forts, even when they believed they were merely houses of balance, were drawn into that larger grammar, their stones whitening each season as if shame were a kind of salt. On Sundays, the chapel inside the walls, filled with voices soft and northern, a psalm that crossed the equator carefully, while outside a drummer counted a separate covenant with a stick that knew how to talk. The lines did not meet, not really, and yet from time to time a kindness slipped across. A woman given water through a barred window, a sailor learning to say good morning in a language where dawn has more than one name, a clerk who altered a number because mercy outweighed obedience for an hour. The sea, indifferent in its duty, bore everything: rum that remembered sugar, muskets that remembered forges, people whose own names were being peeled away like labels from a jar, and the ships, their bellies quiet with terrible cargo, leaned outward toward islands, a world away where cane fields waited like static seas. In the evenings, the fort's roofs caught a last square of gold as the sun folded itself behind palm and dust, and you could hear, beneath the hour's tidiness, a moral unease, like a creak in timbers, an old house admitting to itself that some loads are wrong, no matter how precisely weighed. Letters travelled north with careful penmanship, describing prices, repairs, rains, the health of garrisons, the fractiousness of neighbours. What they did not say was carried anyway in the ink's small shine, the hesitations between words, the sudden mention of a hymn heard through a door. Local chiefs arrived in cloth that moved like water, their retinues a choreography of pride and caution. On the table lay schnapps and solemnity. Terms were spoken that tried to harness tides with syllables. Beyond the palisades, the town had its own pulse, mortar pestles thudding like the heart's left hand, smoke shouldering upward from courtyards, children learning to coax little fishes from rock pools, as the tide withdrew with a chuckle. At night bats wrote quick black calligraphy across the moon's page, lanterns under the arches made shallow stars, and the surf continued its lesson that return is a rhythm, not a promise. He, factor, chaplain, corporal, learned to sleep light, as if the heat itself were a conscience. He learned names that did not stay. He learned that the drum says more than the ear can carry when the ear is trained by bells. Sometimes a storm shouldered in from the west, bruised and purple, and the forts showed their second face. Cannon rolled forward with a tired readiness. Powder took the air like a bitter herb. And then the rain, that larger governor, arrived and pounded the roofs until all disagreements were simply In the rinse that followed, the walls brightened again, and the markets resumed, and a boy traced the outline of a ship with his finger in the sand, and wondered where names go when the sea insists. Far away, in rooms trimmed with holly or frost, coin clinked approval, and a map on a council wall seemed to smile. But even there, a window would sometimes rattle with wind, and someone would look toward the dark, as if listening for a drum they had never heard. The forts endured changes of flag, the way trees endure different birds, quietly, without illusions. What stayed constant was the tide, and the fact that power arriving by sea always carries two truths folded together. That order can shelter, and that order can be used to hide a wound. Toward the end of certain years, when the harmattan washed the sky to bone and the air tasted of distant deserts, the horizon sharpened, and the islands to the west, names murmured in counting houses like almost prayer, St. Thomas, St. John, St. Croix, leaned nearer in the mind, their cane fields bright as knives in the sun. The forts, hearing that unseeable summons carried along the trade winds, squared their shoulders and kept their watch. The drums answered with the steadiness of people who owned a longer story. And out on the anchorage, a ship turned her bow into the swell, rigging, whispering, as if the sea itself were urging her onward, past the red earth and its echoing stones, toward emerald water and tall grass that rustles like fire when the noon wind comes, toward islands where night will smell of molasses and stars and the soft ceaseless hum of labour. And on that far shore lanterns were already being trimmed. Night on the islands carried two perfumes at once, molasses warm and astringent as bruised fruit, and sea salt rising in a silver mist, and between them lay the hush of fields that worked even when they seemed to sleep. Cain whispered in rose as the trade wind combed it like hair. Mills turned with the patient groan of creatures that knew only circles. In the boiling house, the kettles breathed like tired animals, copper throats taking in green juice and exhaling brown sweetness until the air itself grew heavy with a sugar that did not forgive. They called the harbours by kingly names. Charlotte Amalie tucked around St. Thomas like a handful of lamps. On St. John, Cruise Bay small and stubborn, the restive hills watching. On St. Croix, Christiansted and Frederiksted facing two different weathers, and along their quays, the Sound's old grammar tried to keep its poise, show, pay, pass, but the ledgers here carried a darker arithmetic, one already murmured by forts along the red coast a world away. Columns of barrels and hogsheads moved in concert with columns of bodies, and the island nights learned a second sorrowing music beneath the hum of trade. Under Danish flags that cracked like crisp linen in the bright noon, merchants read accounts, surveyors counted rows, and factors wrote neat letters that crossed the Atlantic in the company of thunderheads. Yet all this steadiness hovered over lives pressed flat by a calculus that could not be made moral, no matter how carefully ink was dried. On the heights, above the harbour, at St. Thomas, a watchtower, later called by pirates' names to romance what never deserved romance, kept its cool view of roofs and rigging. Down in the lanes, free people of colour practised crafts with pride and tact, their shop signs painted with a steadiness learned from storms, their lives balancing on the fine string between opportunity and ordinance. Moravian brethren, faces pinked by the heat and consciences pricked into wakefulness, set up chapels where hymns borrowed the island's vowels. They taught letters with a patience the planters sometimes called subversive and sometimes called an economy. After all, a literate hand can keep books, can tally, can pray. At dusk, when the sun fell behind blue hills and the sky held on to gold, as if reluctant to finish its shift, drums climbed the wind, carrying speech that could braid grief and hope into sentences no governor could wholly hear. The Creole on the air, made and unmade itself, quick with invention, faithful to survival. You could hear a different story in the clatter of the cooling pans, in the squeak of yokes as oxen pulled carts toward the wharves, in the way lanterns swung among the cane like slow stars following a furrowed constellation. Historians, careful not to dress wounds with gauze of rhetoric, still speak softly about 1733 on St. John, when hills that had been patient grew teeth, maroons and field hands rose, with a plan carved out of the island's ravines, took forts whose stones had believed themselves secure, and proved that fear flows uphill as easily as water runs down. Retaliation came with the cold grammar of empire, precision, ships, decrees. But memory does not accept decrees, and the hills kept their knowledge, as coral keeps the sea's stories quietly in its bone. St. Croix, taken into the Danish fold that same brittle year, rolled out its green like a carpet meant to impress investors. Grids were drawn so straight that crows could learn to fly them. Mills sprouted like pale spines against the sun. Water, enslaved in aqueducts, did its part with no prayers asked. There were ameliorations, then resistances to amelioration, then the long, aching argument over what a human owes a human. And all the while, sugar flowed, rum burned, and the sound's distant bell kept counting silver that had learned a bitter aftertaste. Names entered the island's mouth and changed as they travelled. Von Scholten is one the archives keep, a governor who, in 1848, standing before a crowd whose patience had run out, said words that were already true in the air. You are free. But long before the proclamation, freedom had been rehearsed nightly in small acts. An old woman teaching a child a forbidden song, a man hiding a second name under the first, a couple meeting by a salt pond where moonlight made the surface look like hammered tin. In daylight, commerce held its face, warehouses breathing spices and sweat, bookkeepers blotting neat columns, consuls in white linen learning, which quarrels to ignore. In the shadows, love made arrangements and memory made maps. The islands did not belong to any one tongue. Danish curtsies, Dutch bargains, English curses, Akon proverbs, French gossip from a visiting sloop, all moved like fish through the same net, and somewhere in the weave a new music took hold, impatient with categories, yet exacting in its joy. Hurricanes taught humility, with a palm and a roar. Afterward, roofs were nailed in a different rhythm, and the chapels filled with a gratitude that tasted of wet wood and survived mattresses. On Sunday mornings, the bell at a Lutheran steeple argued gently with the rattle of gourds and the lick of a quattro from a yard behind. By afternoon, the wharf grew busy again, and sugar hogsheads, stamped, iron-hooped, mute as riddles, rolled toward boats that knew the colour of money in many currencies. Sometimes, when the sun went down cleanly and the sea forgot to be cruel, a man at the quay would close his eyes and listen for a far northern sound, imagining the toll bell at the sound, the watchman at Kronberg tasting fog, the clerk turning a page in a city no hurricane could command, and he would feel, almost tenderly, the slender thread that tied this bright, bruised archipelago to the pale corridors of home. Yet tenderness is not absolution. The islands remained a lesson written in sugar and sweat, that order can both shelter and hide a wound, that profit, left alone too long, grows a rind no prayer can soften, that freedom, when it comes, has already been standing quietly in the yard, waiting for the door to open. Night, honest and unsentimental, laid its shawl across the cane again. Stars blinked like slow fireflies. The kettles cooled, popping to themselves as if remembering the day. And out past the reef, where lanterns spaced themselves like beads on a string, ships breathed in their sleep. Somewhere beyond this sweetness and salt, nearer the mists where maps smudge into one another, a narrower question waited, not of islands and oceans, but of borders drawn on fields and mines, of a frontier where lines move like grass in wind, and toward that quieter contention the story began to turn. The border in the south was not a line so much as a long, breathing grass. It moved with seasons of law, and with the footsteps of farmers who spoke two tongues to the same cow, with bishops who signed in Latin and thought in Low German, with merchants who counted in riksdollars and dreamed in marks. Schleswig and Holstein lay there like two brothers who shared a coat, one stitched to Denmark by the old Ida, the other glancing toward emperors and eagles, and a Danish king wore them both as duke, the title sitting on his shoulders like weather that could change at any hour. Fields rolled down to creeks where children learned two words for the same cold water. Market days sounded like braided rope, dialects winding without quarrel until politics tugged. The Danevirk, earthwork as old as a stubborn memory, slept in its green trench and dreamed of Vikings. Sometimes, in winter, men walking its lines swore they could hear the past arranging shields, yet the modern world asked for papers instead. In council rooms, with stoves ticking softly, maps were smoothed and smoothed again, stripes of colour pressed against each other like lips that could not decide whether to kiss or bite. Through the 18th century, the question hung like a lantern at twilight, who belonged to whom and how, while in the capital candles guttered in chandeliers above conversations that preferred philosophy to ploughland. And yet the frontier, patient as soil, kept its arithmetic. Oaths to crown, rights by charter, barn lofts where Danish lullabies rose through rafters lined with German psalms. When the 19th century walked in with firmer boots, the quiet arithmetic began to show its teeth. In 1848, the fields shook with news. Revolutions elsewhere flaring like dry straw, and men of the duchies, complicated in their loyalties and proud of both their languages, called banners from corners where they'd been folded too long. War came through the fog like a cart late to market. At Bov and at Diebel, the air learned a harsh grammar of powder and command. Then, for a while, armistice, the sort of lull that feels like breath held under water. The Ida, poor old line, listened to treaties spoken over its shoulders and tried to go on looking like a river. The first quarrel subsided into the hum of law again. Protocols, protocols, always protocols, and cattle returned to their measured chewing. But storms remember the houses they liked. In 1864, Prussia and Austria, brisk with modern appetite, came up through the sleet. Wheels bit into thawing roads. The redoubts at Diebel were asked for more courage than they had sleep to give. Somewhere behind the guns, on a hill that had once collected songs, a boy pressed his palms to his ears and felt the ground speak anyway. Denmark shrank in a morning that seemed to last for years. The duchies were unpinned like a hem and stitched into another garment, and the wind that ran across the fields sounded different afterward, sharper, as if vowels themselves had been trimmed. Yet loss is not the same as silence. People stayed and did the work that keeps memory honest. Crosses set in churchyards, whose sermons had to choose their grammar with care. Schools where children learned to say the Lord's Prayer 2 ways and meant it both times. Kitchens where soup thickened the same on either side of a new border stone. The songs grew softer, but they did not stop. Far in the future, but visible even then, to anyone who has watched winter give way without victory, another morning would come. 1920. Ballots instead of bullets. The frontier asking its people to speak in the gentle arithmetic of homes and graves. Northern Schleswig, Söderjylland, came back into the small kingdom's palm like a bird that, having found enough crumbs on both windowsills, chose the one with the older nest. Flensburg sighed and stayed where it was. Lines were redrawn with rulers and hesitations. Flags learned to lower themselves without insult. The South remained a lesson written in hedgerows, that identity can be a hand with 2 warm sides, that a hymn in one language can finish in another without blasphemy, that a farm cares more for rain than for rhetoric. In Copenhagen, where court gossip moved like perfumed weather and talk of enlightened rule folded itself around porcelain cups, the frontier's slow ache reached the throne as a dull pressure in the temples. What is a crown to do when land behaves like water? Tighten its circle, some whispered. Learn to listen more closely, others said, letting law speak in a lower voice. And in those rooms where mirrors doubled candlelight until it looked like mercy, a new figure would step softly, a doctor with careful hands and quick thoughts, whispering of reform as if it were a medicine, of absolutism as if it could be taught to breathe more gently. While far away, along the hedge-lined lanes of the south, a child closed a gate at dusk and heard both names for night settle on the fields like the same kind shore. The rooms were bright with mirrored light, a softness that made power look almost tender, and within that glow a crown learned to whisper to itself, absolute, yet curious, whether mercy might be a stronger alloy than fear. The king, young and breakable as a thin glass, paced through evenings where laughter sounded 1 beat too high. Courtiers kept their masks adjusted, their smiles lacquered, their words dressed for weather that could change between one bow and the next. Into this delicate theatre stepped a doctor, Johann Friedrich Struensee, carrying not a sword, but a bundle of instruments whose names were gentler. Hygiene, inoculation, freedom of the press. He spoke of lessening torture as if turning down a lamp, of easing the tax on peasant breath as if opening a window. He touched the nerves of a court that had grown used to the poetry of control, and the rooms inhaled sharply. Could a realm ruled by a single will learn to sleep more peacefully by sharing its air? Historians still lean over this period with careful hands, debating in low voices how much was courage and how much was presumption, whether a physician's pulse, quickened by Enlightenment pamphlets, overran the patient's capacity for change, or whether his brief sunrise simply revealed a day the kingdom would, in time, come to claim. The Queen, Caroline Matilda, winter pale and restless, found in him a mind like a warm current. Gossip, which is history's shadow, embroidered its own designs across their closeness, and at masked balls the music turned more intimate than tradition could bear. Yet among the silks and the suspicions, laws were quietly rewritten, in a round, neat hand, guild restraints loosened so that work might breathe, censorship unbuttoned so that sentences could walk farther before they tired, the press of peasant service lightened so that shoulders might straighten at dawn. Copenhagen itself seemed to sit up straighter. The air in hospitals learned a new discipline. Midwives were trained. A city that had already rebuilt itself from ash now felt a second subtler repair taking hold, as if the mortar between its bricks had been stirred with clearer water. Absolutism did not vanish. It hummed the same low note, but someone tried to change the key. And power, hurt animal that it can be, tilted its head uncertain. There were evenings when the doctor's steps sounded too loud on the palace floors. He moved quick, filed faster, signed with a hand that believed time could be saved like coin. Enemies, some principled, some merely affronted by speed, began to gather their papers and their grievances. The king's unsteady mind brightened under the doctor's careful presence, then darkened in pockets where old fears pooled. The queen, freer in speech than etiquette preferred, gave the rumour-mongers their firewood. Yet outside the mirror-bright rooms, a clerk smiled to find a pamphlet uncensored. A farmer measured a day and found it lighter than the year before. A student traced the new contours of permissible thought and felt his lungs fill. In those small chambers, the reform became more than theory. It entered bread, breath, and the opening of windows on a thawing morning. Still, the court's choreography, ancient as pride, reset its steps. Masks began to harden into faces. A dowager with winter steady hands, Julianne Marie, and her circle, Goldberg, quiet and patient as a clerk who knows where the old keys are kept, readied their remedy. A night of doors, of gentle voices grown firm, of signatures teased back into older shapes. The coup came without drums, the way frost comes, sudden to the eye, long prepared in the dark, and by dawn the palace had returned to a tidier geometry. The doctor was taken. The queen was led away like a rumour sent into exile, and the kingdom folded its brief bright experiment with the careful regret of someone storing summer clothes too early. Sentences that had wandered newly free were called back indoors. Presses learned to lower their voices. The law's recent warmth cooled by degrees until the old temperature reasserted itself as if it had never left. Struensee's end was meant to instruct more than to avenge, and instruct it did. That mercy practiced too quickly can look like insolence, that power prefers its own pace, that even a kind hand must tip its cap to custom on the stairs. And yet a seed, once handled, leaves a scent. Many who had breathed those weeks of wider air would not forget the reforms, partly repealed, partly bruised, partly absorbed into common sense, continue to murmur in the corners. Better streets, cleaner rooms, a stubborn belief that words want to travel farther than fear allows. Absolutism, still a quiet crown, lived on, but it had learned something about the weight of its velvet, about the tenderness required to carry a people through winter. Scholars, turning pages in cool archives, still note how ideas delayed are not ideas denied. The king's signature, in later years, would sometimes land where Struensee's pen had once hovered, as if the realm's hand, though chastened, remembered the rhythm. Far from the palace, in parishes where wind scours the churchyard stones until the names feel newly carved each spring, the whisper of reform settled into practice like silt, schoolrooms a fraction warmer, a midwife's tools a shade cleaner, a tax forgiven with a nod that travelled farther than trumpet or decree. If the court resumed its measured minuets, the country learned in small steps to waltz with tomorrow. Outside, winter rehearsed itself on the harbour, drawing thin glass along the edges where holes kissed the quay. Pilots talked low in the fog, remembering that rules at sea are older than any edict and kinder when kept. Northward, in the long union where Norway's mountains lend their weight to Denmark's lowlands, and the two countries breathe through the same chest, the cold had been listening. Ships threaded the Skagerrak with provisions and petitions. Timber tall as judgment slid down valleys toward masts that would carry both grain and law, and somewhere beyond the headland a bell tested the air, preparing to count a new weather of promises. The doctor's brief flare, the court's return to composure, the people's knack for making use of what kindness survives, these would travel along that corridor of water into fjords that hold winter, the way a hand holds breath. For power, even when quiet, turns toward its neighbour's warmth, and soon, in the long light and long dark of a dual realm, the kingdom would feel another persuasion at its elbow, the steady, snow lantern patience of a union that had learned to endure. And in that pale glow, two shores would listen to each other, as if the sea between them were no barrier at all, but a single, sleeping lung. It lasted long enough for habits to grow bones, so long that two countries learned each other's weather as kin do, finishing one another's sentences in fog and in thaw. They called it a union, yet it felt, on most days, like a long winter in which one hearth did the counting and one forest kept the fire. In Copenhagen, the crown sat steady, a quiet engine that ticked in silver and decree. In Norway, the mountains held their breath like folded wings, letting timber, tar, and fish descend the valleys, the way prayer descends the throat. Absolute rule came in like a frost in 1660, crisp, clarifying, geometric, turning the old balance of nobles and bishops into a single, weighty centre, yet even as the velvet grew heavier in the halls, the fjords answered with their own arithmetic, the measure of a mast, the strength of hemp, the slow courage of men who read weather by listening to it. Bergen breathed its damp trade across the centuries. Drones of cod hung like old hymns under eaves. Trondheim kept its green-gabled patience. Farther north, the sea wore a stainless face that taught humility to any keel that tried to write on it. It was Denmark's glove, people said gently or ruefully, depending on their kitchen's politics, and Norway the hand inside, supplying timber for fingers and tar for seams, thickening the grip that guarded the strait and pushed holes into the blue. Wars with Sweden came and went like hard winters that start earlier than expected. Treaties with names that sound to modern ears like distant bells. Brömsebro, Roskilde, Kiel. Trimmed borders or traded coasts like patches on a coat. Yet between each clang of steel, life continued in the rhythm that truly holds a realm. Tithes gathered with apologies when harvests failed. Catechisms memorized in winter light the colour of pewter. Ships repaired in silence while snow swallowed the hammer's noise. The Union made a single navy of many tempers. From Holman's docks in the capital to the ice-bitten boat, sheds on cold inlets, masts rose like patient trees. The fleets learned to speak in a dialect of oak and orders, of shore leave and salt beef, of maps that insinuated an edge of the world and dared men to find it. In parishes along the long blue mouth of the Norwegian coast, pastors preached in Danish letters that had learned to bend toward local vowels. The schoolmaster's chalk made the same small click on slate, whether the window held Baltic fog or a fjord that seemed to be breathing from the lungs of the earth. The language of the law walked in Copenhagen shoes. The language of weather wore boots with Norwegian mud. The two met in doorways and did not always quarrel. a farmer in good Bransdale might bless a decree, whose mercy arrived late, but still warmed the pocket. A merchant in Christianshavn might count the barrels of tar that kept a palace roof from weeping. Together they endured what neighbours bring as tests, Swedish incursions that rattled windows in Jutland and rattled hearts in Östlandet, English policies that pinch trade like a too-tight glove, the way Europe's great arguments sent small bills to be paid in far bays, where gulls, impartial and sleepless, wrote their bright marginalia above the news. There were rooms of laughter too, coffee warmed by an Arctic lamp, Ludwig Holberg setting a mirror before vanity so courteously that the vain laughed with everyone else, a fiddler in a valley whose tune threaded from wedding to wake and back again, stitching a village across years like neat darning. The pietists came, and for a time the music lowered its eyes, then the enlightenment, and the eyes lifted with a cautious brightness. In Bergen, Hanseatic counting houses learned to share their shadow with newer firms whose ledgers smelled of local confidence. In Copenhagen, porcelain cooled on blue-painted shelves, while a scribe bent over sea letters that promised safe passage to captains whose hands shook only when the night took too long to end. The Union's tenderness lay in small, stubborn mercies. A timber quota adjusted because a valley had lost too many men to ice. A widow allowed to keep her pier because her boys would be sailors if the Lord permitted. A loan extended to rebuild a bridge the river had unlearned. Its failures, like the cracks in winter glass, radiated quietly from a few too bright points, a capital that listened to itself more than to the hills, conscriptions that treated bodies as if they were merely numbers on a masthead, officers who spoke with the smoothness of policy to fishermen who spoke with the roughness of wind. Historians, gentle with words sharpened by time, will say that such a union holds when both partners believe they are warmed, and frays when one feels merely worn. And yet for centuries the wool held. Roads were cut into mountain ribs, as if writing a sentence inside a living creature. Post-riders learned the taste of snow different in every valley. In Copenhagen's mint, coins received a face recognised in Tromsø as readily as on Amager. The sound's toll kept humming its practical aria. Norge's forests kept the ships in voice. The North Atlantic outposts, Iceland's sagas muttering under their breath, the Faroes pinning clouds to the sea like discreet hats, pulled the Union's shadow far and thin over a pale geography that required patience more than ambition. When storms took, the taking felt familial. A wreck on the Skagerrak drew prayers in both lungs. A poor catch in Lofoten meant a lean candle in a Copenhagen kitchen, where a clerk who had never seen such light paused to think of cod the way one thinks of a lost uncle. And then there was the longing that winters breed, the wish to find an easier door through ice, to shorten hard routes with a stroke of audacity. In taverns, where the air was salted with old voyages, men traced a finger along maps as if calming a restless animal. Northwest, always northwest, a passage rumoured like a kindness you hear of second hand. The Union had supplied ships, pilots, a calculus of will. Already it had sent curious minds toward white edges, men who believed that if a strait can be ruled by fairness, perhaps a continent can be persuaded by patience. One of them would carry a name that sounded like a knot in wood, Monk, solid, stubborn, oddly beautiful. When the light struck it right, he would take with him the Union's virtues and its dangers, endurance, economy, a confidence that order might cajole chaos if spoken to in the proper tone. For the moment, though, the two kingdoms, one low and windy, one high and hushed, went on breathing through the same chest. Bells counted hours in Copenhagen. Ice groaned like an old door in Tromsø. And on a winter night, when stars looked close enough to touch with a wet glove, a keel nudged outward from a dark quay, lanterns sighing, as if the sea itself had opened one eye to see who was bold enough to ask it for a hidden road. He followed a rumour that had the shape of mercy, a door through ice that would shorten hunger and widen trade, and the rumour had a name already heavy with prayer, the Northwest Passage. Under a king who loved ships as other men love horses, he took 2 hulls northward, the Enhjørningen, with her proud mythical head, and the smaller Lamprennen that seemed made for slipping through difficult thoughts, and steered past familiar fog into a brightness so cold it felt like a polished idea. They entered Hudson's wide, withheld bay, where the compass quarrels with itself and the sky carries its own lamps. Summer pretended to be enough. The sea broke open like glass lifted from warm water, and seals, unconcerned, wrote their small commas in the margin of the world. He sounded the inlets, read the mouths of rivers as one reads faces in a crowd. And when the year turned its back, he chose a shore that promised least harm, a low, treeless quiet near the mouth of a river that would later be called Churchill, where driftwood told a story of upstream forests and snow rehearsed its long sentence on flat ground. They built winter the way sailors do, out of rope ends, prayer and practicality. Masts stayed standing like stubborn thoughts. Decks were made tight against the whisper that creeps. A forge took its red breath and behaved like a small heart. Logs were hauled as if lifting time itself. The aurora walked above them without sound, green silk brushed by invisible hands. And the men, Danish, Norwegian, German, a few words of everywhere, learned a new grammar of patience. Chew slowly, move slowly, speak softly, because sound seems to crack in the cold. Historians, careful with their distance, still debate the exact mixture in that venture's cup, ambition and science, obedience and daring. But the winter itself answered with a simpler arithmetic. When daylight is brief, every kindness lengthens it. When the scurvy comes, it writes in bones what no chart can erase. They kept notes in tidy hands, while gums swelled and joints muttered. They hunted when weather allowed, lifting meat from a white world that gives nothing for free. They boiled spruce to coax a bitter hope into the blood. Death, unhurried and efficient as an old clerk, made his rounds. Names were spoken, then folded. Shoes were placed beside bunks they would not be asked to follow. The forge cooled to a darker red. A man stared at his hands as if they belonged to a colder stranger, and then looked away. He, monk, whose name sounds like wood that has learned to hold, kept watch over the ledger of the living, adding fewer entries each week. He wrote a will. He wrote instructions that read like prayers. He learned the taste of sleep that opens at every sound. In March, the wind grew a different edge. In April, the sun lifted its face and remembered the trick of warmth. The ice, tired of its own meaning, loosened its arguments and began to go. Of 64, the tallies say only 3, monk and 2 men whose names deserve the same care as a king's, rose with the melt, gathered what life remained, and turned their hands to the small ship, Lamprennen, because the larger beauty was too heavy with the dead. They launched her like a promise made in a thin voice. She took the water, surprised at being asked again, and the bay let them out, as if it had been holding its breath just for that. The passage had not yielded. Sometimes the world refuses to be shortened by hope. Yet the voyage returned, bearing a harder gift, the knowledge that courage must be taught to stop when wisdom says so, that the North does not bend for banners, but respects a steady hand that backs away alive. They came home by degrees, coastline returning to its proper scale, gulls speaking the old grammar, fog softening into a familiar cloth, and when monks stepped onto a quay that remembered him in the ordinary key of ropes and fish, and the bell that counts an honest hour, he carried inside him a winter no map shows. He reported with the exactness of a wounded man, the lies charts tell, the way stars behave when cold becomes a god, the medicines that came too late, and the mercy that sometimes comes as turning back. Christian's court took the news into its mirrors. Copenhagen listened with the respect a city owes a man who has taught it what not to demand of the sea. Some years offer triumph, some deliver instruction in a heavier hand. In the cathedral at Roskilde, where kings and queens sleep under red brick that hums with centuries, bells learn to hold both kinds of news in their bronze, the peal that lifts a crown and the toll that honours a returning mortal. On certain mornings, when the sound was lacquered with light and the fortress listened like a wise dog, those bells travelled farther than stone should allow, crossing fields and low water, and touching the hands of a survivor, straightening papers at a table. He would pause, hearing the metal carry both rebuke and blessing, and the page before him, tide marks, bearings, a small careful drawing of a wintering place, would seem to breathe. Far away the north kept its white council. Near at hand, a realm quietly arranged itself for the next thing asked of it. And in the nave where dust floats like sleep in sunbeams, a soft vibration continued long after the note had faded, as if time itself were listening for the next footfall in a long measured procession. The cathedral rests like a long red breath on the rise at Roskilde, its twin spires pointing with patient fingers toward a sky that has changed its mind 1,000 times, and within its brick ribs the north keeps a ledger that is not of coin but of names. Step softly, and the floor replies with the low timber voice of centuries. Dust floats in sunbeams like a pale incense of time. The bells, when they speak, pour a bronze warmth into marrow that remembers winters and weddings with equal courtesy. He would come here sometimes, a king unbuckled from ceremony, a queen with a shawl drawn close, a counsellor carrying a private ache, and in the hush they became smaller in the most merciful sense, held by a house whose patience reduces noise to proportion. Coffins lie here like sentences laid down to rest, each in a grammar of its age, ship-proud sarcophagi of early faith with lions dozing at the corners, Renaissance marbles that have learned to breathe as softly as linen, Baroque flourishes made humble by dust that knows no style, later chapels panelled in woods that keep their own forest size under varnish. Margrethe lies here, the weaver of crowns, Christian the Fourth, who built as if building could persuade fate, waits under a canopy where angels have grown quieter with the years. Queens with names like winter flowers, Dorothea, Sophie, Louise, are gathered into an arrangement that could be mistaken for a prayer answered in many stanzas. Historians still lower their voices when they explain the compromises of succession and the way love and policy learn to dance without stepping on each other's hems. Yet the stones are kinder than the chronicles. They forgive the page's sternness by showing how sleep equalizes rank, how even a tempestuous rain becomes, in brick and shadow, a steady chamber of memory. The air remembers hands, masons whose rhythm set these walls, organ builders who taught wind to come back as music, bell founders who poured fire into forms that could speak with dignity to clouds. Children once tiptoed behind their elders and guessed at which pillar might be strongest, which crown heaviest. A widow learned which corner caught the warmest light at noon. A young prince listened to a sermon and wondered why duty sometimes feels like a tide, arriving whether or not one has the right shoes on. In the side chapels, carved canopies hold their breath over sleepers whose portraits now live in the soft colours of dust. A long nave offers a measured road from door to altar so that grief and gratitude can walk without jostling. Bronze epitaphs wear a green patience. Alabaster has learned to look like bread. On winter mornings, the organ's first note finds frost still clinging to the leaded panes, and the building answers like a living creature, its rafters settling, its floor returning the sound in a low, approving hum. It is not a museum, though visitors count its marvels. It is a conversation conducted in the long tense of belonging, the country telling itself over and over that kingship is a circle, and that circles must be closed gently, with rites that calm more than they impress. Names wander here from many shores. The scorner that was lost, but still sends a memory of orchards. The Norwegian valleys that fed masts and psalms into the Union's chest. The islands where sugar burned a lesson into conscience. The forts along a red coast that taught the terrible double grammar of order and wound. The warm verandas at Tranquil where letters first learned to sit in Tamil. The cold bays where Monk kept a ledger of survival with a pencil that shook. All those threads arrive and lie down in these chapels, not to be erased, but to be folded into a larger cloth, so that when a bell is rung for a sovereign, it also rings for a fisherman, for a seamstress, for a clerk who straightened coins with an honest thumb, for a widow who knew the measure of a tide by ear. The monarchy's story, its mending and its stiffening, its bright experiments and cautious returns, takes on the temper of liturgy here, confession that is also gratitude, praise that remembers to be practical. Candle flames lean as people pass, then re-centre as if practicing what governments should practice, moving for the living, then resuming a steady, useful brightness. Sometimes in that stillness a visitor feels the old quarrels soften. Was the realm an empire or a necklace of careful agreements? The stones prefer the second answer. Did the toll at the sound tax God's road, or by a fairness that kept knives from waking? The bells answer by counting evenly. Were the islands only profit, or also a wound that demanded lifelong tending? The organ balances its chords so that both truths can sit in the same pew. Here debates become hymns, and hymns teach the body to breathe in long, forgiving lines. Even struancy, who passed briefly through the realm like a spark both generous and dangerous, finds a place in the mind's side chapel, a reminder that reform is a kind of tenderness that must learn the rhythm of winter if it wishes to survive spring. The cathedral's brick, burned earth lifted into order, seems to say that endurance is made, not given, that memory is a craft, that a small kingdom becomes large by keeping its promises over long distances and longer years. On All Souls' evenings, the nave fills with the gentle murmuring, the soft cough, the carefully folded coat, the page turned by fingertips that respect paper as if it were skin. A reader stands beneath a vault that has taught itself to be sky and speaks names until they sound less like claims than like thanks. Somewhere in the high dark, a draught wanders, and for a moment it feels as if the past had come back as a breeze to check the locks. Outside, the fjord breathes its old silver. Beyond the ridge, fields square their shoulders for another season. In Copenhagen, not far as the bell flies, a fortress faces water with its practiced calm. Warehouses sleep with their doors to the sea. Pilots keep their lanterns where hands can find them without looking. The country, gathered in this long room of brick and light, rehearses its gentlest strength, the art of placing what has been into a chamber where it will not trouble the living except to steady their steps. Yet even houses of peace learn the sound of thunder. In the early years of a new century, rumours went through the aisles like a sudden change in weather. Napoleon speaking too loudly, Britain listening too hard, fleets measured by the acre, not by the ship, treaties multiplied like reflections in a mirror. The bells, dutiful as ever, kept their hours, but wind at the coasts began to taste of iron. Boys in the capital stood longer at the quay, watching the horizon for a handwriting they could not yet read. In the royal pew, the cushions remembered many prayers and added a new one, that prudence might be heard across water, that smallness might be shelter, not invitation. A sacristan, closing the great door against a rising draught, felt the wood shiver as if anticipating a louder knock than any congregation could make. And somewhere out on the grey, where gulls wrote their pale marginalia above a city of masts and steeples, sails gathered like storm-bent wings, a squadron drawing near with its own liturgy of signal flags and cannons, the kind of dawn that does not ask to be blessed but arrives with its creed already fired into the air. Dawn came with a grammar that was not the city's own, signal flags speaking in a code of distance, gun ports blinking like cold eyes, a fleet drawing itself up with the pomp of geometry against the low pewter of the sound. And then the thunder began, not a sudden clap, but a liturgy. Broadside, pause, answerless prayer of smoke, then rockets lifting with the wanderer's hiss that would give them their name forever after. Copenhagen, which had learned to sleep by the even toll of hours and the soft arithmetic of dews, woke to a different counting. It was September of 1807, late summer holding on with the stubbornness of ripened fruit, when Britain, measuring the world through Napoleonic weather, reached across neutrality to seize the Dano-Norwegian fleet before France could. Historians will explain the calculus in cool ink. Alliances like ice floes, a small kingdom asked to choose between storms, but the streets knew it as heat. Congreve rockets scratching red, cursive across the sky. Shells arching like brutal stars. Roofs taken fire, the way dry reeds take wind. Bells that had faithfully rehearsed peace rang into smoke. Mothers learned the art of carrying water in darkness. Men who had mended hulls all their lives suddenly mended doorways and arms. The fortress on the headland, so long a listening house that governed with ledgers more than with cannon, found its stone voice and answered as it could. Yet proportion, that old virtue of the strait, has no defence against a doctrine of safety that arrives with a squadron and an ultimatum. The British lines on the fields outside the ramparts settled with the unhurried confidence of those who know they command the hour. Batteries exhaled flame. The city's breath came shorter, quicker, as sparks walked the roofs like careless angels. Children learned a new map of home, street by street, bucket by bucket, while fathers judged the wind the way pilots do, except now to steer the ember instead of the keel. In courtyards, the wash of firelight turned faces into masks. In churches, the stone kept cool, even as air shivered with impact. In cellars, people listened for a rhythm that would tell them when to run and when to be still, and always the long, sliding hiss of the rockets, as if someone were drawing a blade through silk. Those days lengthened into one continuous bruise of sound. Between salvos, the city remembered itself. Bakers smuggled bread into hands that shook too much to count coins. A clerk, his fingers ink-stained as ever, wrote down the names of streets that would need timber by dawn. A midwife held a lamp in her teeth, while she tied a knot no shell could untie. On the water, boats, those ancient ambulances, moved where they could, their oars whispering old comforts into new fear. Up on the ramparts, a gun captain, who had memorized the sound's gentle rules, found himself learning the mathematics of reply. He thought, absurdly but truly, of wheat, of whether the harvest beyond the smoke would want for hands, and in that thought the city's soul persisted, practical, sorrowful, exact. The bombardment, 3 nights and days that felt like a season, cut its dark script across the skyline. By the 4th morning the air tasted of metal and ash, and even the gulls seemed to lower their voices. Capitulation came like a sigh that had been waiting in the chest. The fleet surrendered, holes that had once been the Union's long breath now taken as trophies to another weather. The decision looked different from every window. Treason from some, prudence from others, inevitability from those who kept tallies of powder and bread, but for the streets it meant quiet, the kind that hurts first and then helps. Fires, tamed by exhausted hands and a merciful change of wind, settled into dark seams. Smoke thinned into a grey that remembered ordinary fog. Morning stepped cautiously among the ruins and found both ruin and routine. A woman sweeping glass from a threshold with the same care she would give to crumbs. A boy rescuing a charred toy ship and floating it again in a basin as if to remind water of its older promise. A priest blessing a bucket line with a nod because words were brittle. The city, which had already rebuilt itself from earlier flames of its own making, looked at this new ash and chose again the discipline it knew best: measure, repair, fairness. Not bitterness, though there was salt enough, but the old habit of making tomorrow resemble today as much as decency allowed. There were reckonings that could not fit in ledgers. Neutrality, once a gentle garment, now felt thin as gauze. The corridor of water that had sheltered a people's steadiness proved also a corridor for other powers' fears. The loss of the fleet unseemed more than a navy. It tugged at the stitching that bound the north, sending tremors up the long cord to fjord and fishing village, forward into years when accounts would fail and treaties would take their toll in land as well as coin. But even as such shadows lengthened toward a bankruptcy that would sting in 1813, toward a sundering that would write 1814 into the Union's bones, the city's smaller courage went back to work. Carpenters set right angles against the memory of rockets that preferred arcs. Masons lifted new brick with hands that smelled of smoke and mortar together. Pilots returned to the sound and found, to their mild astonishment, that currents still kept their promises. In counting houses, men who had flinched at every distant thud now bent again over columns, discovering in numbers a quietness that did not betray grief, but gave it somewhere to rest. Widows learned the new measures of their days. Sailors without ships learned to walk on land with purpose. Children remapped their city by counting scaffolds instead of shells, and under the rubble the old arteries of canals and lanes persisted, insisting softly that a city is not made only of what stands, but of what connects. As the first cold of autumn found the cheeks of those who worked in the open, the air tasted clean again, and the mind, escaping from the clamour, began to imagine a different kind of line, one that moves not on water but across fields, carrying the same promise of schedule and shelter, tying interior towns to the harbour's pulse the way ligaments tie bone to bone. In workshops where sawdust drifted like domestic snow, a few men unrolled drawings that murmured of iron, of wheels, of a steady clatter that might one day replace the memory of rockets with a kinder music. For a realm taught by seas to breathe in tides, the thought was almost a prayer, that after thunder rails might sing, that after red cursive in the sky, black rails on the earth might write a calmer sentence, that a small kingdom could teach itself to inhale from inland as well as from the whale road, and out beyond, the rebuilt roofs where the fields darkened toward evening and the first frost rehearsed its delicate script on stubble, you could almost hear it, a far faint rhythm gathering itself like the measured heartbeat of a new road coming home. The first rails arrived like tidy underlines upon a page long, written in water, straight where tides are curved, punctual where wind keeps its own counsel, and the small kingdom, sore from thunder and trimmed by loss, learned a new way to breathe. He stood at a cinder-scented platform where a bell, cousin to the harbours, marked minutes instead of tides. Iron waited with a patient shine in the morning. A whistle stitched the air, and then the cars moved with a confidence that felt almost medicinal. After bankruptcy had humbled the ledgers, and a treaty had sent Norway, like a beloved book, to another shelf, the nation turned inward without turning away. Copenhagen to Roskilde first, then farther, lines drawn as if a careful hand were mending a torn cloth from its centre out. Jutland's long back, once known chiefly by hoofbeat and hymn, learned the even clatter of wheels. Bridges discovered their own courage, laying timber and then iron across waters that had long preferred boats. Ferries met rails like handshakes across the belts, so that a traveller could carry a thought from heath to harbour without it losing its place. Stations rose with brick that remembered the city's scars and promised proportion. Arches that offered shade to milk cans and soldiers alike. Clocks whose faces quelled hurry by making it seem respectable. In the cars, light glanced along windows and turned fields into a passing fresco, rye like brush gold, churches whose spires practised their good manners, hedgerows holding, with priestly discretion, the gossip of birds. Farmers who had once measured distance by the ache in a waggoner's shoulders now watched their butter, cool in tin-lined boxes, whisk towards ships in time to catch a better price. Cooperatives, those quiet republics of necessity, spread like daisies along the lanes, teaching villages the arithmetic of together. In halls warmed by coal and conviction, men and women rehearsed a new liturgy. Share, improve, endure. Folk high schools opened their long windows to young lungs. NFS Grundtvig's broad, patient voice travelled not by sails or semaphore, but by syllable, asking the land to know itself without scolding, to sing in its own key. The June Constitution came like a door opening from the inside. Absolutism, having learned something of tenderness and cost, set down its velvet and became a quieter thing, still a crown, but one that preferred counsel to command. The papers multiplied, printers' hands blackened with a cheerful industry that believed daylight could be taught to sit on a page. Debates about borders, about schools, about the price of wheat, found platforms beside platforms and discovered that argument, kept civil, is a kind of rail itself. It carries heat without burning the house. Along these lines the old empire thinned into memory without becoming a reproach. The sound, still counting fairly, adjusted its manners as the century asked. The headland fortress kept its listening posture even as artillery learned new voices elsewhere. In the archives, ledgers closed on chapters spelled with cinnamon and sorrow, and new books opened that smelled of ink, hay and machine oil. Children followed their fathers' fingers across maps, where blue had yielded space to brown and green, and were told, for truth and comfort, that greatness has more than one grammar. Workshops, busy with small exactness, the radius of a wheel, the thread of a bolt, the bearings patience, began to hum the way harbours once did at dusk, and the city discovered that making things in rooms can steady a people as well as mending sails in wind. Telegraph wire ran along embankments like a bright nerve, and messages travelled with a speed that would have seemed impolite in an earlier age, yet even haste learned to be humane when channelled by schedule. The rail's promise, like the sound's toll, was an old virtue in a new suit. Predictability is hospitality. If you arrive at 8:53, we will be waiting. If milk leaves by dawn, it will return by coin before the candles gutter. Meanwhile, out in the recovered quiet of parishes spared from cannon, the daily sacred continued, a plough turning dark grammar into food, a midwife buttoning her cloak against a wind that whispered of fjords she would never see, a schoolmaster chalking dates whose digits were becoming friendlier. Trains respected such lives by knitting them together without asking them to become something they were not. In winter, when snow scrolled its pale script along the sleepers and the stove, glowed like a small opinion no storm could bully, passengers dozed as gently as parishioners, boots aligned, hats tilted over brows, dreams keeping pace with mileposts that passed like numbered psalms. In summer, windows dropped and air came in smelling of hay and distant salt. The country, which had once looked outward for breath, found itself inhaling from within and did not feel smaller for it. There were losses still. At Dibble, the ground kept its hard lesson. At the southern hedge, the wind said 2 names for every field. And yet the rails practised a consoling discipline. Return will be possible. Meeting is a solvable problem. Butter and bacon learned to be ambassadors. Porcelain and songs travelled in opposite directions and arrived without quarrel. Newspapers, fresh from presses that never fully cooled, carried arguments like careful cargo and returned with compromise like rain returned to river. From the cab, where coal turned to steam with a hiss that sounded like forgiveness, the engineer watched signals blink, their simple ethics: stop, go, wait, and felt, as the fortress's watchmen once felt, that civilization is a matter of consensual timing. The sea still owned the horizon. Ships still shouldered the long blue to Reykjavik, to the Faroes, to Greenland's white, to markets that remembered their manners because they liked their mornings calm. But inland a new tide rose and fell, commuters learning the comfort of countable minutes, harvests riding to port as if grown on rails, children going to schools their grandparents would have called impossible, and coming home with words that fit the old kitchen just fine. In Copenhagen, cranes learned to pivot toward stations as easily as toward docks. In Esbjerg, a town stitched swiftly to the coast by necessity and plan, quays and platforms faced each other like 2 good friends who share work and never tire of speaking. The realm, narrowed on maps by the unforgiving quarrels of others' empires and its own, refused to become thin in spirit. Instead, it perfected its older craft, the keeping of promises across distance, by ledger, by bell, by schedule. And as the century leaned toward another, one whose machines would be louder and whose storms would demand harder reckonings, the country tested its balance like a dancer learning a new step. 1 foot on the rail, 1 foot on the quay, breath measured by both inland clock and harbour tide. At dusk, when smoke from engines lifted like grey prayer and the sound turned its old mirror to the first star, he stood on a small station's platform and heard underneath the metals mutter the sea still breathing in the dark. The 2 rhythms did not quarrel. They braided And somewhere beyond the yard's last switch, where track becomes line and line becomes the idea of departure, a softer horizon waited, no longer an empire's reach, but a small kingdom's wide gaze, content to be exact, content to be kind, content to let the tide and the timetable teach each other how to keep time. And out there, at the edge where night gathers its coat, another bell lifted its voice as if to welcome a gentler ending yet to come. In the end, the map grew smaller while the horizon grew kind, and a country that had once measured itself by sails and distant stones learned to take its size from promises kept close to hand. The sound still breathed with its old silver. The fortress on the headland kept listening more than speaking. In towns where rails stitched parish to port, clocks learned a courtesy that soothed the day, and across low fields a quieter grammar took hold, a language of schools and co-ops, libraries with lamps pooled like warm tea, parish halls where argument found its manners. Loss had taught the land a stern tenderness, ships taken, borders trimmed, winters endured, and from that discipline grew a craft finer than empire, the making of home so well that strangers could rest inside it without fear. Bells, once called to thunder's work, returned to their patient counting. Ledgers, once forced to memorize cinnamon and sorrow, now carried the modest arithmetic of milk and mortgages. Trams and textbooks, pensions earned by hands that had learned to trust routine. In kitchens under clean windows, bread cooled on racks with a steam that smelled faintly of rye and memory. In workshops, neat as hymn books, metal learned to fit metal with the old harbour's exactness. On coasts that knew the whale road's moods, new towers turned their pale faces into wind and taught it to sing into wires. Bridges reached where ferries had once whispered. One, long and harp-like, drew the two shores toward each other until the strait felt more like a smile than a separation, and under its span the old traffic of masts continued, relieved to find that modern grace can befriend ancient patience. In brick schools warmed by radiators that ticked like small reassuring clocks, children practiced a citizenship of ordinary decency, voices that wait their turn, hands that help stack chairs, a habit of disagreeing gently. In council rooms trimmed not with guilt but with good light, officials learned to read budgets the way pilots read tides, watching for storms, trusting in norms, remembering that fairness is not a theory but a schedule one keeps. The story did not forget its shadows, occupation's grey boots, a night of whispers by the harbour, the quick courage of neighbours who ferried lives across Blackwater as if rescuing their own names, hardship that visited with the indifference of weather and went away with the slow courtesy of recovery. But the shadows shaped, rather than soured, the day that followed. In churches that smelled of candle wax and salt, in synagogues made bright again after fear, in meeting rooms where coffee steadied the table's edge, the country practiced a humility that did not excuse itself from joy. Design, in rooms as calm as morning, taught chairs and lamps to be honest. Bakeries taught crust and crumb to get along. Bicycles threaded the streets in quiet parades that looked like hope keeping its appointments. On islands where wind combed barley the way time combs memory, grandparents told the young how the toll once made predictability into shelter, how a map can shrink and a soul expand, how bridges are only rails laid gently across water. And in the capital, where spires still learn their manners from the weather, where canals keep their glassy breath even in winter, a watchman could still stand at the water's edge and hear the city counting softly. Ferry horn, tram bell, lid lifted from a pot. A child laughing at a gull's bad temper, the hush of pages turning in a library that smells of paper and rain. It is not a grand music, perhaps, yet it lasts. At Roskilde, the old kings sleep on, their brick cathedral holding them like a deep pocket. At Kronborg, the guns rust politely, while the windows go on, keeping faithful squares of light. At the sound, the pilots lift their lamps, as if saluting an ancestor. Out on the fields, the rails hum to themselves in a key that flatters wheat. If there is an empire left, it is carried in gestures, a bus that kneels for a stranger's tired step, a teacher waiting an extra beat for the shy one's answer, a clerk refusing to let a decimal stray where it might hurt someone, a nurse checking the latch on a patient's door as if it were the door of her own house, and when night gathers its coat and goes walking, the country goes with it, not afraid, rehearsing its old lesson, that civilization is consent to shared timing, bells, tides, trains, breaths, and that kindness, kept regular, is stronger than any shout. So let the masts keep their gossip, let the bridges play their long strings, let the wind write its lean marginalia across the dunes, let the clocks mind the minutes with a neighbour's patience. Thank you for walking this long tidal road with me, through fjords and fires, ledges and lullabies, distant chapels and near kitchens, until the story learned to sleep in its own sofa warm house. Now the lamps are trimmed, the harbour is a single slow mirror, and the bells, somewhere beyond the roofs, are counting, not to hurry us, but to remind us that we are held. Thank you for keeping company through these northern nights. Rest now. If you listen closely, the sea is breathing for you, and the rails are humming far away like a promise kept.